Welcome everyone to our MemLab Network September 2021 webinar. And this is actually going to be our last one for probably 2021. So I am really thrilled to have with us today the Senior Digital Archivist at the Computer History Museum, Elena Colón-Marrero. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And just so thrilled to have her here talk about migration in digital preservation and a lot of other stuff that we've touched upon, but that is always a good refresher. And I'm sure Elena's gonna give us a lot of things to think about in addition to what we've already learned. So thank you so much and take it away, Elena.
Pleasure. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen real quickly. Okay, can you see my slides? Obligatory question.
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm going to kind of go ahead and get started. So yeah, once again, my name is Elena Colón-Marrero, and I'm going to kind of talk about all things migration, specifically how to take care of the digital media carriers that you've migrated data to, and that your patrons have migrated data to, and then whether or not you should migrate your file formats, I guess is like a really kind of big question. And to give you some background about myself, I currently work at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California as the Senior Digital Archivist, where I manage the institution's digital collections and historic software collection. I have also served as the 2015 John Foster and Janet Avery Dulles Archival Fellow at the Mudd Manuscript Library at Princeton University, where I conducted a survey on born digital media within their collections. And I also have a Master's of Science and Information from the University of Michigan with concentrations in archives and records management and digital preservation. And to date, almost all of my work has just been with digital objects and digital things. So this webinar is going to be split into two sections. The first is going to be a brief-ish overview of digital storage carriers and how to manage the materials on that media, because that's kind of your first phase of migration, really. And then the second is going to address the, I guess, eternal question of whether or not you should migrate your file formats to newer formats. And I'll mention some free or low-cost resources on how to open those files and migrate those files as well, especially for anyone who may not have whatever the current subscription model is for like the Microsoft Office suite. And so I'm probably not going to take all 90 minutes of your time or maybe even a full hour, but I do hope to give you some information that will allow you to take back to users of the MemLab, and that'll be practical for at-home use. And I think that's just really important because what we do in the field is not necessarily practical or the thing everyone can do at home. So the tapestry of formats. In this section, I'm going to be discussing some common digital media carriers that people may transfer items to and some concerns and risks related to preservation of these items. Some of this information may be very familiar to you, and I do recommend revisiting Ethan Gates's MemLab webinar, Digital Storage Crash Course, that goes into a lot more and deeper detail than I will probably be getting into. But there is probably going to be some information that is familiar or similar to that if you've watched that. So first thing is hard drives. There are many types of hard drives out there. You have your internal, your external, your solid state hard drives, so on and so forth. Generally speaking, hard drives use magnetic storage to store and retrieve digital information with rotating platters. And solid state hard drives kind of differ in that they do not have moving parts and are more similar to flash storage, which I will talk about after hard drives. So your external hard drives are kind of very easy to acquire. You can get them online at office supply stores, at your Targets, your Walmart, those types of places. And the storage capacity on these can range anywhere from a few gigabytes to multiple terabytes. And some drives may require software installation, but once you're connected via USB, or Firewire, you can generally drag and drop files onto them. And external hard drives can contain a variety of external ports, such as USB, SATA, Firewire, PATA. I think that's how you say that. I don't know. I've never heard anyone say it out loud, so making it up. And most current hard drives generally are USB connected that you can buy. That's probably going to be the most common thing you'll see people have nowadays. And so also with hard drives, they can be kind of formatted for different types of operating systems. And so you may approach a Mac formatted external drive a little bit differently than one that's formatted for Windows. And it could be worth knowing what a person's hard drive has been formatted for, or if it's been formatted at all, because depending on the type of operating system you end up plugging that hard drive into, the computer may try to reformat the entire drive, which could result in kind of lost data. And so it'd be important to make sure that that doesn't happen kind of during any of the migration or transfer processes. And so the quality of external drives definitely varies. It can be a good idea to, if someone's asking you, like, what hard drive should I buy, to tell them to check reviews for drives and to potentially find reliability reports like the one that's on the screen from Backblaze. And so these reliability reports are usually created by industry groups, but do include information for failure rates and for specific models of drives from a variety of manufacturers. And Backblaze is a good source for these reports because they do make them kind of publicly available. And this, as you can see, is from Q2 2020, so it's a little bit dated, but they do try to do it a report kind of every quarter. And so external hard drives do come with their own preservation risks, and not all external drives are kind of made equally. And so because of that, current guidelines to replacing external drives are anywhere from every 5 to 7 years. You may see things that say 3 to 5, but generally I think hard drives have gotten better as technology has progressed. So you can kind of wait a little bit longer to kind of migrate to a new hard drive. But it is recommended to kind of check on those backup materials as often as you can, or at least at minimum once a year. And the more write and erase cycles you use are kind of means the higher the chance for the drive to fail. And with all external hard drives and all really digital media carriers, they are susceptible to bit rot and file corruption. And so some preservation risks, as I said, not all hard drives are made equally. They should be replaced every 5 to 7 years, though there might be some that fail sooner than that. And the more you use a hard drive by adding and deleting things and content, the higher the chance the drive will fail. And you might not think it's important to say this, but I think it's very important to say this, that external hard drives should be encased in a hard shell. If not, then you're really risking dust and debris and other things from getting onto kind of those platters and those disks and kind of harming it physically, which then will harm the files that are on it. So just kind of keep an eye out to make sure that the drive is still in a case if someone is bringing those things in. And then the hard drive should be stored in a cool, stable environment. You want to avoid large temperature swings and large humidity swings if possible. So as I recommend, like, don't leave your hard drive in a hot car during the summer. I mean, there are many other reasons not to leave your hard drive in a car, but just be sure that it's in a kind of a stable environment as possible. And if someone asks, like, where should I keep it? Just keep that information in mind if someone asks. And so you have your solid state media devices, which use flash memory and can be things like USB memory sticks, memory cards, SIM cards, SD cards, mini SD cards, and so on and so forth. This list is very long, and I'm just going to focus on flash drives and SD cards because that's usually what people have on hand more often than not. But you're more than welcome to do some research into other types of solid state memory devices, the website, the Museum of Obsolete Media, has a very comprehensive list of all the possible types of solid state media out there. So if someone comes in with something very weird and strange that you've never seen before, I definitely recommend going to the Museum of Obsolete Media site, because they have pictures and descriptions that you can try to match things up against. And so USB flash drives are probably the most common type that you're going to find around. They were first introduced commercially in the year 2000, and these drives are smaller and faster than floppy disks and CDs and DVDs, and are generally more durable. And they are more often than not pretty immune to magnetic interference and scratching. You're going to need like an incredibly strong magnet to wipe all this stuff off of there. So there really isn't a problem if your cell phone gets kind of put up against one. It shouldn't delete any of the data on there. And USB drives do draw their power from the computer via the USB connection. And depending on the age of the flash drive, because I know some people tend to keep them around for a really long time if they don't lose it first, it may have a USB-A port, and some newer ones do have USB-C. Some even have both. And flash drives at first started with around like 8 megabytes of data, and they can go up to 2 terabytes of data today. And you might come across some flash drives that have their own hardware encryption built into them, because as I said, flash drives can get lost rather easily. And so that is kind of protection against any data being on there being stolen. And I know that I've lost dozens of USB drives personally. And so that's just something to look out for. But the construction of a USB drive, if anyone ever asks, there is a small circuit board that's inside of it, and it's usually insulated by plastic or metal or some silicone or rubberized casing. And there might be a removable cap or a switch that you flick up that reveals the USB connector. And then you may also kind of find some secure digital or SD cards, mini SD cards, micro SD cards. They're used in cameras, smartphones, tablets, gaming devices, and so on and so forth. You kind of name it. They are flat and a lot smaller than a USB flash drive, which means they can even more easily be lost or misplaced. And their storage capacity is around 32 megabytes to 2 terabytes of storage. And so just like hard drives, they can also only sustain a limited number of kind of write and erase cycles before they start to fail. I don't know if anyone has had a USB drive fail on them because you're using it a lot. I know I have, so that is something to watch out for. And there are estimates that flash drives are expected to have between 10,000 and a million write and erase cycles, but you'll generally know if it's starting to fail if you can't copy, if it's having issues copying things to it, and it's not because it's full, like it has plenty of space, but for whatever reason you can't copy something, or you can't open files and files are becoming corrupted, that might be a sign that that flash drive or that SD card is failing. And these drives just like don't give you advanced warning that they're going to fail either. I know there are some external hard drives that will give you kind of advanced warning that it needs to be replaced. But flash drives and micro SD cards usually don't do that. And since these things are small and can fit in your pocket, as I said, they can be really easy to lose or misplace. You also need to watch for bending of the USB insert. Like this picture of a very severely bent USB drive, like they could still work, but that might actually break your flash drive at the end of the day. And any flash drives that have a case to cover that USB insert, if that's missing, you do risk getting damage inside of the drive by dust and debris kind of going into it. And similarly, loose SD cards can be bent or snapped, and they can gather dust if they're not in proper housing, like a plastic container of some sort. And you'll also want to ensure that flash drives and SD cards are also kept in like a cool, dry place with a stable temperature, and that they're not at risk of being crushed or bent by other objects. So kind of throwing it in a backpack without any type of protection may not be the best option for it, because if you have like something heavy in there or heavy books, or you step on it, you might crush those things. And if you put a USB drive in a computer or an SD card into a computer, be sure to eject the drive properly before you remove it to avoid any corruption or damage. And just to avoid leaving drives in the computer for a prolonged period of time, especially if you are not using it. So try to take it out when you're done using any of the items that may be on there. But when it comes to general preservation rules and ensuring that that you have access to your data for, I like to say as long as possible, because forever doesn't really exist with digital copies. You'll be sure to follow the 3-2-1 rule that like every digital preservation person and IT person kind of touts. So this just means you want to keep at least three copies of your files, and you want to store your files on at least 2 different or separate devices. And lastly, to store 1 copy as far away from you as possible. And practically speaking, this can take many forms. Probably one of the more popular ones in my very non-scientific informal polling of people that I personally know is 1 copy can be on a hard drive or a USB drive where things are copied to. A copy of those files can be transferred to a personal computer or your laptop. And then another copy can be stored on a cloud service such as Google Drive or Dropbox, Apple Cloud, or any of the other services out there. And that 1 copy far away from where you live may either be mailing a USB drive or a hard drive to a cousin that lives maybe out of state, or just a few towns over if you don't have anyone that lives out of your area. Or it could be using that cloud service, because that cloud service could count as somewhere kind of away from where you are. And you also don't have to have only 3 copies. You can have as many or make as many as you like. It's really just finding the combination that works best for you personally, that is going to be something that you actually remember. And I think that's also really important. And if you're saving files really to anything, whether it's a drive, your computer, a cloud service, you want to check on those files as often as you can. Many digital preservation professionals say to check them at least once a month. But honestly, I would say just pick a schedule that works best for you, because practically speaking, everyone's lives are different. You may not have the time or capacity to check on all the copies that you have everywhere once a month. So just checking on a regular schedule that works for you is key. And checking often just allows you to catch any degradation or hardware failures early. But as I said, like, life happens. So even if it's once every 6 months or once a year, that's still better than nothing. And because most hard drives only last 5 to 7 years, that is also something to keep in mind, that the less often you check it, the more likely it is that you will forget it. And forget where it is, or forget where you put the hard drive, because at some point that hard drive will fail. And if you forgot where it is, it might fail before you find it or get to it. So trying to create reminders for yourself to kind of open up some of those files and to check them, whether it's on a calendar, or if you prefer either paper calendars or digital, putting it in there to be like, today is the day that I take out my hard drives or USB drives or whatever it may be, and I will check everything. Making those reminders will kind of help you to ensure that you don't forget about kind of all of your media that might be out there. And for those that kind of want to go like above and beyond, you could create and regularly check what we call checksums, which are digital signatures that are just long strings that are really not human readable, that ensure your files aren't changing or corrupting over time. And checksums can be generated by several different utilities and can be stored on a file, either with your files or on your computer. And those that feel really comfortable kind of going above and beyond the call of duty and are really comfortable with computers, they can use command line tools to generate checksums, or there are services that have a graphical user interface or GUI, like Quick Hash GUI, which is I believe, either free or low cost. That's available on almost all of the operating systems out there, at least the major ones. And you can use that to generate the checksums and do what we call a fixity check, which is checking those checksums against current checksums of the files. And as long as they're the same, everything theoretically should be the same and should be fine on those files. And I mentioned this because there are some people that are just overachievers, but honestly, I think the average person is not going to go this far in checking their files. I mean, personally, I don't even do it for my own personal files. I just do it for the files that I am paid to make sure are staying the same, because it does take time and is a bit of work, and especially if you have a lot of files to check. And so what I would say the simplest thing to do just to ensure that the files aren't being corrupted or aren't degrading would be just to open and close a sampling of the documents that you have, whether it's photos or play some videos that you may have on the hard drives, or play audio back to make sure that it's still looking the same, sounding the same, that you remember. That could be kind of the easiest way and the most accessible way for people to ensure that their files are doing okay. If you start having trouble opening things, or if the computer is saying it can't open something or it's corrupted, that's kind of a sign that something is going on with your storage media, and that you might want to migrate that to a new media to double check that it isn't your storage, and it might be the file itself. And so I've gone through some of the formats people may be taking their materials home on, and some of their risks and ways to kind of check those files to ensure that the files are lasting for as long as possible. And now I'm going to try to attempt the answer, should you migrate your file formats? And so this is a big question that I'm not going to have a satisfactory answer for, because it all depends. It really all depends on what your goals are and what the intent is at the end of the day, and sometimes what those files are. And I know it's not the nice, clean answer people really look for, but it's the honest answer that I can give. And so there are definitely kind of a series of questions that you want to ask people, or have people ask themselves, or you can ask yourself in making this decision. And so there's the first question: are these files important to you? And what are they? Are they work research files? Are they personal? And what are the file types? Like, exactly what software do you need to use to access these? Are they text documents, Word documents, word processing, spreadsheets, presentations, photos, videos, etc.? And then of those files and file formats, are the file formats open source? Are they proprietary? Do you need like one very specific type of software to open them? And also, are they widely used type of formats? As in, like, your kind of PowerPoint and Excel and doc and text files and JPEGs are probably more widely used than maybe an older version of, say, AutoCAD in those files. And maybe if a file format isn't widely used anymore, or a file format is extremely proprietary, you may want to migrate those files that you have identified are worth keeping. If there are files that you just don't want anything to do with, then you may not want to bother migrating those at all, and just dedicate those resources and that time to the things that you really want to save. But there are kind of things to consider before you migrate. Migration of file formats does have its own risk. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it about a file that you want to keep? And this is especially important in the case with Word documents or presentations and certain kinds of spreadsheets. Different software are going to render those files differently. And this can impact any formatting, special effects that you might have on it. Like if you did word art on your early 2000s Word document, that word art may not render the same on like today's version of Word or Google Docs or whatever you might be opening those things in. If you have a formula, or if you're using special features that only come with that original software, those things may not migrate over when you change the file formats. And just simply put, a WordPerfect file from the 90s is just not going to look the same when you open it in the current version of Microsoft Word, or even if you use the LibreOffice software, which is a kind of free to low cost software suite that kind of mimics the Microsoft Office suite. If you use OpenOffice, it may not open the same or render the same. And it's unfortunately a fact, and it's a risk that you're going to have to assume when you're migrating file formats. The only way I know how to get around this is to keep the file in its original format and use emulation to open those files in the original software. I am no expert on emulation. I know Ethan Gates also did a presentation on software emulation. And so I would encourage you to go back to that if that is something that you're more interested in, because Ethan, I would say, is definitely more expert than I am when it comes to emulation and running older software and opening kind of older files in that software. But if you don't necessarily care about rendering the file in its original format, in its original software, and you just want to make sure you can still open them and get some of the content out of it, migration is definitely the way to go. And so I'm going to mention a few file format migrations that are for more common types of materials that most people would have. I'm not necessarily going to touch on video because I believe that there are people out there who are more qualified than I am to talk about kind of migration for video formats, because that's a bit more time and intensive than I have the ability to go into, and should be its own thing completely. But for, say, text files or your data documents, you can use programs such as Microsoft Word or Excel to convert those formats to a current version of Word or Excel. So your DocX or your XLSX, which are the current versions of that. So if you just have a doc or XLS file, you can open it and save it, or save as if you want to retain the original file format. You can use those current versions. If you don't have access to Microsoft Office Suite, there is the LibreOffice suite of products that can view and convert files, and it might be a much more cost-effective option for users. And you can download that, I believe, on most operating systems as well. So if someone comes in using like Linux, that is a good option for those individuals as well. And I do believe Mac comes with kind of their own things, and generally you can open those documents in those as well. And if you really need to, you can use Google Drive and try to upload them in the Google kind of Drive and Docs environment. Just keep in mind, formatting will change across all of these things, but that's just a risk that you are taking when converting them. There are some preservation quality formats that you can convert them to that have their own pros and cons. So you can convert things, especially if you don't want to edit them, into PDF or formatted text and image documents. For spreadsheets, you can convert to CSV, or you can even go for a simple text document, but just keep in mind, especially for text and CSV documents, you are just point blank going to lose formatting on there. But it is an option out there if that's what you want to do. And it is kind of a doable choice. When it comes to kind of images and photos, for most people, JPEG or like a GIF format is good enough for them. I think most common people are going to use is JPEG. I think that's what people are most used to as well. If you want preservation quality, especially if people are scanning images or if they already come in this format, TIFF or RAW files, especially if people are kind of transferring things from digital camera, they may have it set to a RAW format. Those are more preservation quality and can be converted into other formats as well. However, I will note that for TIFF and RAW files, those files are much bigger than JPEG and may not be the best if you're going to share or transfer with others, especially if there are family photos that people want to share with other family members. JPEG is probably going to be the best bet and will take up the least amount of space. For audio, which I will kind of admit isn't my strongest area either, MP3 format is something that a lot of people are familiar with, especially thanks to kind of the popularity of kind of your Zunes and your iPods and all of those things that people generally don't even use anymore. But like MP3 or AAC is good enough preservation quality. I think that's the one that's going to be most familiar with people, especially if they use Bandcamp to download anything, would be WAV files. I would say you can generally open that in most players that just kind of come on your computer, and images and photos can generally be opened in most kind of photo viewing things that come kind of prepackaged with the computer. Again, you could also upload them to a cloud service that can generally render some of these things as well. These formats aren't like the end all be all. As technology advances, services are going to change, and there are going to be other formats that are going to be more popular and are going to be the cool kids on the block. And so you may need to continue to move on from any of these formats to something whatever is kind of new and is widespread and is most commonly accepted. And so the best bet in prolonging the life of your digital files is to just stay on top of migrating them, not only from your digital media carrier, but also in format as often as possible. And even for those that are more adventurous and like a challenge, trying to emulate those things as well. And I will note that I haven't touched on the file types that are super proprietary and require specialized software. I know I mentioned AutoCAD, but AutoCAD files and some versions of Photoshop are a little bit harder to migrate. And these types of formats are just harder because not every version of the AutoCAD software or the Photoshop software or even other specialized software is backwards compatible. And so you may need the very specific version of that software that was used to create that file to render it. And it might take some digging and essentially what is forensic work to figure out what is the most recent version of, say, AutoCAD that you can open this 90s AutoCAD document in. And it may not be the version that's out today. It could be a version that was out 10 years ago, and you have to track that down and try to kind of keep converting them into what is more recent formats with older software. And so that's just a lot of work, and it's a lot of trial and error to just figure out exactly what software and hardware that you need to render those files and to convert them into a current format so that they are accessible. And I know there are institutions that are really working on these things, especially when it comes to architectural drawings. And say Photoshop can be easier to migrate in some cases, but say if it's anything from, say, Autodesk, you're going to have a hard time with some of those older Autodesk files, converting them into more recent things. So that might be the case where emulation is the way that you're going to go. And so to kind of summarize whether or not you should migrate your files, it's all going to depend on your end goal. If you want to preserve the formatting, the look, and the feel for your files, then I would say no, do not migrate them. Utilize some sort of emulation service or figure out how to emulate the software that you need on your current computer to kind of render those files and to look at them. If you don't necessarily care about the formatting and look as much, you want to ensure that you can at least access the content some way, somehow, that you want to open them, then I would say, yes, go ahead and migrate those file formats. For kind of the most basic content that most people create, which is going to be your spreadsheets, your PowerPoints, your Word documents, things like that, and some of your images, it's going to be actually probably easier to just migrate them right off the bat. And many times you could just use the software that comes on your computer. And so, as I mentioned, the Microsoft Office suite, the Mac equivalent, the LibreOffice suite, Google Docs are all available. And you can also search for other services online that'll do this, migrate things and change your formats, even if it's, say, like you want to change a JPEG to a PDF for some reason. You can kind of Google for those services. Some of them are free. Some of them do have a nominal fee to it, especially if you don't want a watermark. But there are kind of those other services out there. And also, you can always do both. You can retain a copy of the file in its original format and then create another copy that you update to the current file format so that you don't lose that original file the way it was, but you can still open kind of that content in current software. And then you kind of get a best of both worlds situation. And so with that, I kind of want to thank you all for your time today. And I hope I was able to pass on some information that you can share with others. And if you ever have any questions at any time, feel free to email me at emcolonm@umich.edu, or just contact me via Twitter. It's at Elena Archivist. It shares the A. Though depending on when you see this, I may or may not be private on Twitter. But if you say that you have found me through this webinar, then I will let you follow me if I am private. And I am more than happy to kind of answer any questions that anyone may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Elena. That was great. Yeah, I was just finding an old article that I read. When did this come out? A few months ago. Okay, March. That was a while ago. It's like time doesn't exist anymore, but about the movie Justice League. I don't know if you heard about that. It's like, you know, there was like Joss Whedon made like just a Justice League, or there was another Justice League movie in 2016, but then they decided to remake it. So they needed to go back to the 2016 files. And it was just like, it's just 2016, right? Completely like outdated. And they had a real hard time and spent a lot of money trying to update like the special effects.
Yes, and all of that stuff is extremely proprietary. It's like one or two softwares and you're kind of stuck with that format. And if they leave it, you don't still have that software, then you might not be able to migrate it. And it's kind of the trouble. It's like people want to use the latest and greatest and newest software, but you never know if that's going to be sustained over time or even accessible. And so it takes a lot of forethought to try to continue to migrate those things. And honestly, most people, even myself, don't necessarily have that forethought all of the time when you're creating things, or you don't even know like something is going to be needed or usable later down the line. Yeah, exactly. That's sort of the thing I definitely try to instill in. And this is another thing of like getting to know your audience and who you're working with and talking to at the lab. Like if you're working with someone who is even just a professional, or a more of like less of a professional and like a hobbyist that does like creative work, you want to kind of, talk to them about, hey, if you want to use this again in, you know, this thing that you're working on in your, either whether it be Premiere or Photoshop or Illustrator and things like that. Like just if you want to maybe revisit it down the line, I certainly know there's some things that I'd love to re-edit that I'm like, I'm just gonna have to start from scratch. So not just keep the originals, but there are definite a lot of issues to consider. And it is very like each software, like you said, each proprietary software is like so specific to what you need to do to try and make it as accessible. Because I know in like, I come from like a film, video editing, video production background. But yeah, I know that there's a way to like in Premiere export, and Final Cut was like this too. I don't use Final Cut anymore, moved to Premiere. You know, you can export like the EDL, the edit decision list, which just basically, which then you could rebuild if you had everything or all the original files, they were fine. You didn't rename anything. You know, you had everything exactly where and named exactly as it used to be, which it's like, it's depending on so many factors. So yeah. And then you get into the whole file management and how are you managing your files to begin with? And so it's like this really big rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah. And that's where it's like, yeah, it does take so much time and effort, and where we do encourage folks to do it up front too, especially if they're creating, do it as early as you can, that like good file naming practices and things like that. But and also just encourage people, like, yeah, it's hard and you don't have to be perfect at it. Like, just do your best, right? Like, that's all we can do. But and Jonathan in the chat, so he mentioned that he was trying to figure out old files with a patron that had on their 3.5-inch floppy disks. And since I guess they were word processor, 1992 in a word processor, and they just got the text out through Notepad, which I guess is Notepad Windows?
Yes, and I know there's a similar version on Mac.
Yeah.
And I mean, Notepad is definitely great about getting some of the text out as much as you can. I know the LibreOffice suite does allow you to open a lot more of those older word processing documents more readily and easily than Word does. I know Word is kind of iffy and choosy about all of that. And so I tried to like compare the two, like one in a text file and one in like OpenOffice to see what they look like compared against each other. Like, what is not formatting right? What is looking like it might be formatted maybe correctly? It's a lot of guesswork because at a certain point, especially if they're not your files, you're not really sure how they were formatted. But you can see kind of how both programs kind of change things as you're opening in. It's a good kind of digital archaeology type work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's like, if you're just trying to get the text out, I guess then you're fine. But if there's any kind of formatting, right, like that's potentially lost. And the other thing I was thinking about was like, doing like PowerPoints, and always having to go to a conference, or now, luckily we can just all share our screen, which I feel like works better. That's why whenever I went to a conference, I would bring my own laptop and be like, I'm presenting off of my laptop because I know it's going to work in my version of, PowerPoint or whatever I had. Whereas I have tried it a million times where I put my PowerPoint on someone else's computer and the formatting is like totally screwed up.
Yep, things get off, your images aren't working, like aren't showing up anymore.
They don't have the fonts installed that I want. So
if you had any transitions, if you had any videos or GIFs, like who knows if they're gonna work.
Yes. So there's like a lot of real world application and like, ways to illustrate, I think, to that, like, it happens all the time. It's gonna happen. The more you wait, the more so just plan for it. But I was wondering if you could mention going back to like checksums, and at least I agree that I only do checksums on like certain things, high value, quote unquote, things to me. Like, I digitized some of my home movies, and so those are kind of really important to me, especially as an AV archivist. So I did some MD5 checksums on those. Whenever I move them, and every now and again I'll run them again and make sure that they're fine. But I definitely don't do that. Photos, literally any other files, honestly. So just to kind of, I've also had experiences of when a file corrupts. I'm just like, ooh, that's an interesting example. I want to like show people, or like, have them look at this file and how it corrupted and why and things like that, just to kind of offer what I feel like it's hard for folks to wrap their head around, like, why is my digital file corrupted? Because I can't see it. So I know that I've had it happen to me when I've tried to like move something and maybe I have another program running and then some bits get flipped somewhere. I don't know if you have any other instances where that might happen.
Because usually it's a bit hard to tell, right?
Yeah.
Extremely hard to tell. I know there are times where if I've had this happen a lot with USB drives. The USB drive happens to be damaged. When you you might be able to add the file there, but once it's there and you try to open it, it just doesn't work anymore. And it could be that the hardware itself is damaged. And so it's changing something about the file when you copy it over. I found a lot of instances when you're moving from one operating system to another, especially if you have formatted your drive to, like, say, Mac, and you try to move over to Windows or vice versa. The way the operating systems work and how they're interacting with your hard drive, and I don't know like the exact specifics of it because it's a bit more technical than I necessarily get into, is just it's just the formatting is a bit different, and so your Windows doesn't want to play nice with Mac, and Mac doesn't want to play nice with Windows, and that can kind of change your files in unexpected ways. And sometimes it's just time. I guess time is kind of your enemy when it comes to digital things. And for whatever reason, something got flipped, something got dropped, or something's missing. And it can also happen when you're converting files too. To different formats. Sometimes it just like doesn't convert properly, and then that kind of quote unquote corrupts your file and it's unopenable.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really good points. Now that I think about it, the one we used to give out free flash drives for DCPL to patrons is like a swag thing at events. And we had some recently and we were like, oh, we'll just put something on this. And then found that it was corrupting files like in there regularly. So we feel like they probably, I mean, it was like almost over 4 years ago that we got these, and they're probably cheaper, because they're giveaway for free kind of thing. So yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah, and those things aren't all made the same. Like you would think that it's really standard and uniform, but sometimes when it's especially really cheap, it's not really built to kind of last. And so there could have been something when it was manufactured that's messed up. And so it might have just been a flash drive that was messed up from the very beginning. And you just didn't know, or you didn't notice. And I know I've had flash drives where in the past I was like doing a scanning project, and as I would scan microfilm, I would add it, export it as a PDF and add it to this flash drive and then switch it to another computer. And I was doing that for months and months for a bunch of files. And eventually like the flash drive just stopped working. Like it was just like, I'm done. This is too much for me. And everything that I had done ended up being corrupted. So I had to redo all of that because the only copy I had of those files were on the flash drive.
Yeah.
And so that's when I kind of went to different places. Like I got another flash drive, but I also made sure I made a copy like in a Google Drive. But even then, there are times where Google Drive or Dropbox or a cloud service may format or render your files slightly differently. So when you try to download them again, they might not actually be the same. And those are just kind of things to look out for. Like the easiest way is really doing the checksums to kind of look out for that. But checksums aren't necessarily foolproof all of the time.
That's true.
And so some things can change, but the checksum never actually changed. And so you just have to look out for that too. So that's where kind of checking your files more regularly, so it's fresh in your brain about how it looked or how it sounded or whatever, is really important.
And like, even changing a file name, can that change a checksum? It's been so long since
I believe changing the file name may not change the checksum.
It's the metadata, embedded metadata. Right? Yeah, which makes sense. But yeah, most folks, we do kind of teach a little bit, and I would like to encourage more embedding of metadata with especially photos at the lab. We do encourage folks to put like a minimum amount of embedded metadata, so that if you would change that metadata sometime later, it would also change the checksum. So so, and talking about erasing and writing on a over and over on a drive makes it less good for it. But what about, I've definitely heard plugging it in and turning it on, just to like run it more like a car. And I know that that's probably more like hard drives because they have all the, or the hard drive disks because they have all the moving parts. Is that not just hearsay?
I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's true or like an old wives' tale type of thing. I mean, there is, I think, potential that the more like, I mean, you're using it essentially, even if you're plugging it in, you're still using it in some capacity. And so, yeah, it could put eventual strain on everything. And so that's also why it's important to like not leave things plugged in all the time, and to unplug them when you're done. So you're not kind of putting that strain and that work kind of on those discs as well. And so,
Great.
but I don't think I can say either way if it's true or not.
Right. It's like, what's the sweet spot then? You know, it's like 5 minutes only. Yeah. Every month. Yeah.
And it's something that would like definitely depend on the hard drive and the manufacturer.
Yeah. So as far as that goes, I know you can't necessarily say buy these or these are good manufacturers or whatever. But I love that you showed that Backblaze, hard drive reporting thing, because that's kind of what I do when I'm trying to figure out, oh, what's like a good, at least a more, has a higher rate of success manufacturer of hard drives. Like I know some years it's like Toshiba's top of the list and Seagate, but then others. So I'm just curious, what is that, how you, like, how would you sort of do if you had to buy an external hard drive or 3 for work? What would you do your due diligence of figuring out which one to buy?
So it's going to depend on what our budget is, for sure, because I think budget's a big thing. Like you can only spend so much. So some of them are just, even if it's the best, it might be too expensive and it's just going to get ruled out. Budget, and then I would consider budget and then size, like how big of ones do I need? And then after that, that's when I would check kind of the reliability reports. But sometimes you may not be able to find the one that is the best or be able to purchase that. And sometimes it's going to come down to, okay, these are the ones that I know are available. Or if you have more kind of hurdles and hoops to jump through, you may be kind of limited by that. So it'd be kind of cross-referencing the reliability reports with what is accessible for you and what is in your budget and the size that you need. Because sometimes you just may be forced to buy the one that maybe isn't the most reliable, but that's the one you have to go with. But at least you can say that, like, you know, what the reliability is and that you're taking that risk. And that's kind of what I would consider. Because I know even just buying personal hard drives, for me, it really comes down to kind of my budget and how much can I reasonably spend. Like, yeah, it's the best, but I can't afford it. So I'm just going to go with the next down the list and work my way down versus, and then considering what's available, because there are kind of still global shortages right now.
Right.
And shipping delays and things like that. So you may not be able to get the thing that is actually the best because it's just not in the stores right now.
Right. That's a really, really great point. And could, depending on so many factors, could get worse before it gets better, sort of thing. And we have purchasing, like we can't buy from certain companies or can only buy from certain companies. And then if we're buying things and need to spend before fiscal year end, but we only have so much money, that's a good point. And I know a lot of our other network partners are in similar boats as DCPL, and how they can buy things. So I just have one more question that I kind of thought listening to to your presentation was about ejecting, which is so important. And I am sometimes so impatient. And also sometimes I feel like I get an error, or if, or I'm just sort of like, why it looks like it's still in there, but I can't, but I pressed eject,
Yes.
blah, blah, blah. I've also heard that you can just shut the computer down and then pull it out once the computer's completely shut down. Is that true? Are there other things that I'm not thinking about?
So, I'm kind of a knock on wood type of person. I may be more like loose and fast with the rules sometimes. But sometimes it's because you have other programs open that may be accessing like that drive and you don't realize it. So what I try to do if it's not ejecting is like shut all of my programs down, like do the Control Alt Delete or whatever the equivalent is on like Mac, and making sure that there are background things running that may be accessing that flash drive or that drive for whatever reason. Like you will be surprised in what's kind of accessing those things. If you've done all of that and it still isn't shutting down and it's still not letting you eject, I always shut down the computer first, because then it kind of kills the power supply. It like kind of closes everything out. And I just feel a little bit safer doing it that way. But I mean, I will say, like, you shouldn't do it, but I do it, that if I'm in a big rush and I really need to go and I can't shut the computer down for some reason, but I need that thing, I will just unplug it and take the risk. But no, you are taking that risk, and it is a known risk that you are taking,
Right.
that something might happen. But essentially it's making sure all your programs that might be accessing that thing are shut down. If it's still not working, just shut all of your programs down. That still doesn't work, to shut the computer down. And if you have a newer computer, hopefully the computer should shut down pretty quickly and be able to restart pretty quickly, so you're not necessarily losing everything. But with that said, if you're going to shut things down and you have other things open, be sure to save those things. Bookmark whatever you need to bookmark if you're needing to shut down, or if it's a case where it's not ejecting, but you're still working on stuff. I mean, you could just kind of leave it in there for a little bit, and then once you're ready to shut everything down, do that.
Yeah, of course, the minute that you like have to go and eject, then and you shut it down is when like the Windows automatic update
Yes.
for 30 minutes. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, it's 3 o'clock now. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. And this was really great, exactly what our partners need to take back to their MemLab users. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
I'll definitely be following you on Twitter soon. So awesome. Take care. And thank you so much.
Yeah. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.